Hey guys, 1HP Medic here, aka Dr. Elliot Smithson, and today on our episode of Evidence-Based Esports, we're going to be breaking down the science behind choking and how it affects us in game and things that we can do about it. But before we get into all of that, we have a very special announcement to make here at 1HP. So as you guys know, 1HP is a collective of healthcare providers all dedicated to the cause of helping gamers play more and hurt less and improving their performance while they do it. But today we have someone new that we're going to be adding to our roster. So as you guys can see up in this corner here, we're going to be playing Who's That Pokemon? Dr. Jonathan Chung. Hailing from Toronto, Canada, Dr. Chung is a chiropractor who has a huge love for helping gamers reach their goals and decrease their pain. Dr. Chung, welcome to the 1HP team.
Hey everybody, it's a pleasure to be part of everything. 1HP does some really cool stuff, and I'm glad I can assist all the gamers out there who want to play better and hurt a little bit less.
Awesome. What's your favorite game, John?
League of Legends, hands down. Easy.
What's your history with League of Legends? Let's talk about that for a little bit.
Man, I started playing League back when I was in undergrad. Me and my housemates were looking for a new game to play after we realized that I wasn't really good at StarCraft 2. And League of Legends was getting more popular at the time. We tried it out, and it just was the first game that made sense to me. Something about the abilities and the way that we were always on the team playing against another group of people felt really nice, and it just clicked. Caitlyn was the first champion that made sense, and it was just, I just have to right click on people and then they die, and then it's great.
Easy. It's just that easy, folks.
Yeah.
All right. So, you just finished up Cairo school? How long ago?
I graduated in 2019.
Okay.
Yeah.
And ever since then, you've been working with some strength and conditioning type of folks as well?
Yeah, so my previous clinic, the owner was actually a sports fellow from the school. So in Canada, there's 3 residencies offered by the school. One is X-ray, one is research, and then one is sports. And the other chiro was a sports fellow, so he taught me a whole bunch of stuff. And it was a nice clinic where we treated people, helped them get better, tried to make sure they stayed better by obviously exercise, because that's really the meat and potatoes of what's going to ensure some long-term changes instead of just an adjustment or some hands-on therapy. Obviously, in the best place, you use both, but at 1HP we love to do a bit of everything.
That's for sure. So what made you interested in working with gamers?
I'm a gamer, and I used to have a lot of wrist pain, and it would stop me from playing the things I loved, and I had to work on myself and do some homework to make sure that I could do what I like to do for as long as I wanted. And that journey is it can be really it can be a little humbling knowing that your body is trying to work against you, and I don't want anyone to have to feel that way. And knowing that I can be a person who can make that a little bit easier, a little bit faster, going back to playing the games you love and doing the things you like to do, that's what it's all about for me. And gaming, I know, is something that's really near and dear to a lot of people. So being able to help someone do what they love to do, that's my biggest goal.
Awesome. All right,
Yeah.
So let's jump right into it. Today we are going to be doing an episode of Evidence-Based Esports where we dive into a journal. In today's topic, we're going to be talking about choking. So the article that we selected for today's review is called Choking Interventions in Sports, a Systematic Review. So because this is a systematic review, we're not just looking at one article. We are looking at kind of a smattering of articles across the board, looking at a lot of different sports and a lot of different interventions and how these traditional athletes manage choking. So let's dive a little bit deeper into that. So what was kind of the objective or purpose of this article?
So like any systematic review, they're trying to condense a lot of information into a more digestible and hopefully applicable form. In this case, they're looking at specifically anxiety-based interventions. Sorry, no, intention-based interventions for choking. So it's for those acute cases of, okay, I was in that situation and my attention was diverted somewhere or taken up by something else instead of what was important, and it impacted my play. And they go through, explain a bit about what choking is, the different interventions based on which model they're looking at, and also what, as any systematic review should, they talk about what future research should be implemented later down the line based on what they have at the moment.
Awesome. So let's ask the big question here. What exactly is choking? How is that defined?
So choking is, to make it as simple as possible, is when a normally competent person underperforms under pressure. So that means that you have to have some baseline of skill in order to choke, because if a person who's completely new to Fortnite suddenly loses in the first round, then that's not unexpected. You're new to it, you've never played it before. Whereas somebody who is a seasoned pro who has gone to the World's Championships or the World Games and loses in the first round by missing a really easy flick shot, that's a choke, right?
Yeah,
Versus,
I think we've all seen that happen many times where there's someone that knows how to edit doesn't hit their edit, or knows how
yeah,
to kind of gank, kind of misses that in the last quarter where it really really matters.
exactly.
Okay, so what kinds of choking do we see, or how does kind of the world of sports psychology break down the idea of choking?
So for them, they come back to what optimal performance is, which is in sport, when an athlete focuses attention on those relevant information processes and behaviors while blocking out irrelevant information, that's when the best performance happens. So they break it down to two big models. One is anxiety based, which is for whatever reason, you're feeling so anxious you can't think about what's important, and then that impacts your play. Or it's attentional based, which is for whatever reason your attention is taken away from what is important, and then you can't process what's important, and your play deteriorates as a result of that.
Yeah. So let's break down these interventions kind of based on the models that we see here. Talking
Hmm.
about the distraction model first. Tell us a little bit more about how attentional cues kind of play into that.
For sure. So for distraction, what's really happening is you can't focus, like we were talking about before, on the important information. And this can come from either an internal or an external source. So internal could be those voices in your head saying, okay, no, this is the last two people in the circle. If I win this, then I win the game. Versus external might be something like your mom is vacuuming in the background and the sound's really annoying and you can't hear the footsteps of the guy who's creeping up behind you in the house.
Yeah. I think we see this a lot in traditional sports as well, where like the roar of the crowd kind of
Hmm.
gets in the
Oh, for
way
sure.
of
Yeah.
people hitting their free throws and things like that.
Yeah.
But you can see the same thing going on at lands, especially when it comes
Hmm.
down to pivotal games like DreamHack and stuff like that. The room can get really intense.
Yep.
And that's something that, unless you're training for it, really can throw off the pros. I
Yep.
know in when I was working in traditional sports at UCF, they would train with kind of these jet engine sounds coming over the loudspeakers to kind of simulate that
Yep.
roar of the crowd. So it is something that we see in traditional sports where those things are taken into account. And those
Oh
internal
yeah.
cues are super relevant as well. Allowing yourself to kind of get in your head in that way can definitely throw your game off. Cool. So, what are
Hmm.
some things that we can do to kind of? We touched a little bit on external distractions, but what are some things
Yep.
that we can do to kind of prevent those internal distractions?
So one of the big things they talk about in this particular study is the use of a pre-performance routine. So that's basically imagery, deep breathing, some cue words that you use when you know you need to perform. You need to shut those other voices up and just do what you got to do. And what it does is it brings you back to, okay, almost like meditation, where you clear out some of those more distracting thoughts and you can focus only on the reticule, only on the other player, whatever you need to get the dub.
For sure.
Yeah.
Um, how does deep breathing play into that?
So, a big thing I like to talk about in clinic actually is how breathing can calm you down. If you focus on the inhale and slowing down how fast you're breathing, it'll actually kick in your parasympathetic response. So when you're really keyed up, you're really tense, you're really anxious. That's usually the sympathetic side kicking in. By turning on the parasympathetics, you level yourself out so you can still function and you can perform the way you want to.
Right.
A good way I like to use is just box breathing. So you breathe in for 4, and then you hold it for 4. You breathe out for 4, and then you hold it for 4.
Yeah.
And that is a nice, easy way. And the thing is, you have to breathe anyway, so why
Yeah.
not leverage it
You
in
got to
that clutch
breathe. You got to
situation?
box fight if you're playing Fortnite. So you might as well box breathe.
Exactly, exactly. And seeing the 4 edges will remind you how many times you should do it.
Right. 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 So, there's different ways that people learn
Yep.
these skills, and that kind of comes back into how distracted or taken back by kind of these choking scenarios they can be. What are the two different ways that people kind of learn skills?
So the first way is explicit, which is through specific cues that someone gives you. For example, the first time you learn how to throw a ball, they might say, okay, make sure you follow through with your arm, make sure your elbow is right here, make sure you follow through with your wrist. And then there's the implicit learning model, which is more based on analogies and trying to learn from within. So it might be, okay, I want you to just think about swiping a paintbrush or just dragging your fingers along the ball, something a little bit more uh, amorphous where you can put your own spin on the cue and learn how to do it a little bit more naturally.
Okay.
And yeah, it's
So
a
that's
fine
more like
difference.
if we're talking about aim training, where
Yep.
you're taking really specific approaches to it. You're going into
Yep.
Kovacs. You're doing the isolation scenarios where you're just working on like horizontal click timing or something like that, and you're really like
Sure.
breaking it down into these steps and kind of using these methods to get to the end result of doing the
hmm
motor task. And implicit, I think, is how a lot of gamers learn in this environment, and we'll talk about that in a second. But I
Yep.
don't know how many gamers. I think you'd see something more like this maybe in traditional music pedagogy, where you
Yeah.
have a very like systematic way of teaching these motor skills. But I think
Yep.
for gamers, the second category is a lot more relevant for how
Yeah.
they learn skills. So why don't you go ahead and tell us about implicit learning?
So implicit learning is based on trying to incorporate those skills in a more non-rote way. So it's not step by step by step by step, but it's instead trying to make it just a whole process. So an example from table tennis would be instead of trying to just hit the ball, you try to draw a right angle triangle with your stroke. And an example that I can make would be something like Melee, where there's so many inputs that are very precise that the step by step, if you don't have those internalized, if you don't have that just kind of trill in your fingers, it can be really daunting for some new players.
Mm-hmm. So how does that affect your ability to kind of perform under pressure when the heat is on?
Yes, so that's the interesting part because for explicit learners, what tends to happen, it doesn't mean it will, but what can happen is you go back to that step by step process. So instead of just letting it flow, you have to go through those particular steps, and that obviously slows you down. And when milliseconds matter, that can be really damaging to your chances of winning. Versus implicit learners, because they never went through those step by steps, they tend to not go back to that place, and they tend to be more resistant to pressure.
Right. Okay. So what are some of the strategies that people can use to kind of um, control those choking scenarios when they happen?
I there's a few they talk about. One is actually something called left hand contractions, and the idea is that you're priming a specific hemisphere in your brain to help. So the right hemisphere is really important for motor performance, and that's connected to your left hand. So what they found was that if athletes would clench their hand with a small ball for 30 seconds prior to performing, then they performed better than athletes who squeeze the ball in the right hand. Granted, this
Interesting.
isn't always, yeah, but the unfortunate part is that that's not always easy when you're in the middle of a
Right.
Fortnite edit battle to
Yeah.
just say, hold on, give me 30 seconds. I just need to squeeze the stress ball for a little bit.
Yeah.
So a way that you could work around that is just with your hand on your WSD, you just flex it a little bit in between when you know you're going into that last climactic duel.
Mm-hmm. Interesting, interesting.
Uh,
Could that also work before like maybe like a intense round of a game like CS:GO or Valorant where you know it's like all on the
oh,
line in this round, where you could
yeah,
maybe
for
use something
sure.
like a stress ball?
Yeah, for sure.
And it's the left
And
hand you said, right? Is that
the left hand.
does
Yeah.
that make a difference between dominant versus non-dominant arms? Like if you're right-handed?
It I don't believe so. It's more so it's based off of hemispheres, not right-handedness or left-handedness.
Okay.
So I don't believe it should make a difference.
Okay.
But I'll look into that and get back to
Word.
you.
All right. So how about acclimatization? How is that used to kind of get used to the types of pressure that we see in end game scenarios?
Yeah, so you can think of acclimatization as basically trying to get used to the pressure. So instead of it being like a giant shock to the system when you're in that really high pressure competitive scenario, you're building it into your training so that when you come to that moment where you have to that pivotal shot, make that pivotal play, it's a little bit easier. So they try to induce pressure during training to simulate that same effect later on. They do this in a number of ways, but obviously it's no replacement for real competition, but it's almost like having a diet soda instead of a real soda. It's close enough where if you squint your eyes and blink really, really hard, maybe it's the same. It's the same idea.
Sponsored, not
Yep.
sponsored by Diet Mountain Dew.
Yeah, exactly. It's still delicious even when it's diet.
Oh, it's still delicious. I'm definitely addicted.
Yep. Yep. For me, it's ginger ale. Ginger ale is the best.
Ooh, interesting choice.
Hey,
Uh,
not
okay.
just for airplane rides.
That's the or being sick. I feel like ginger ale is like the go-to like
Yeah.
sick drink. I don't know how
I
it got
just
that
love.
reputation.
Yeah, but it's delicious. So that's my vice.
I respect it. All right. So, since athletes don't lose physical ability, technical skills, and strategic
Yep.
knowledge during important competitions, what exactly is happening there?
It's not that, like you mentioned, it's not like they're losing their skills. It's more so that they can't show all that they have, and that's typically because their attention isn't on the right things. It's
Okay.
I'm sure you've had that situation where you were trying to play and then a family member comes in and distracts you and then suddenly you lost a big team fight. It's not uncommon, and that's just one example of your attention being drawn away from what you need to do.
Right.
And in this case, it's typically pressure. So you know that there's more on the line. Your attention can't get away from that fact that, okay, no, this is the fight that determines whether my team moves on to the next bracket or not.
Yeah.
And that can be a lot. And if you don't know how to handle it, then it might crush you.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about kind of that distraction model. What are
Okay.
some interventions that are really useful for kind of weeding out those distractions, whether they be internal or external?
Yeah. So, like you mentioned before, it's that pre-performance routine that they study the most in this review. So they use a lot of different things like relaxing mental imagery, keywords, external focus, and temporal consistency. They there's a lot of different options here for pre-performance routine, and it should be very personal. One thing we talk about at 1HP is looking at when you've been successful in the past. So what were those foundational behaviors that brought you to that moment where you clutched out the round and you did really, really well? Is it your sleep, your nutrition? Is it anything in particular you did beforehand that you made you feel like you were ready to play? We want to replicate those situations and prove to yourself that when you're in that do or die situation, you can do. And I personally like to do breathing a lot because it's easy and it's quick, and you don't need anything. You don't need a banana by your desk to kick yourself into execution mode. It makes it a little bit easier.
But if you
Uh,
had a banana by your desk, it doesn't hurt.
no, it doesn't, and it's nice complex carbs to keep you fueled up
Yeah,
for that gaming session, right? Exactly.
a little bit of
So
potassium.
I
We got those
yeah.
electrolytes.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that even for people who tried and did notice a difference, it didn't make things worse. So uh, performance routines, they're a good thing to at least try. You may not notice a huge drastic difference, but it will definitely won't negatively impact your play.
Right.
Yeah,
Can't hurt, might help. It's the
might hurt.
mantra. All
Yeah,
right. So, self-focused interventions. Let's talk a little bit about these.
yeah.
What really are we looking at here?
So there's a few different options that they had. One was dual task. And the next was quiet eye, analogy, or implicit learning. Left hand contractions, fluency cues, task relevant cues, process goals, and neurofeedback training. There's a lot of things to unpack there, but the big ones they really stressed was the dual task and quiet eye training.
Okay.
The implicit learning it's less interesting for some people because implicit learning is really dealing with the problem at the source. So instead of learning things in an explicit fashion, you learn it in an implicit fashion.
Which is more likely
And
what uh, gamers are likely to do, is learn things
yeah,
kind of through their own means and have their own like
hmm
ways of thinking about like their combos or their mechanical skills or whatever.
exactly.
So that so if you have learned something in kind of a wrong way, is this what that's kind of
Yeah,
talking about? Where you're
it's
trying to like fix that
I,
error?
I think for the majority of people, it's not really a wrong way or right way to learn. It's more so what may come more naturally to you because you still have to learn the skill regardless. And if for whatever reason the analogies or implicit learning way isn't working, then sometimes it just works better to go more explicit. And and the good news is that there's also interventions that we'll talk about a bit later that do help those people who were explicit learners and are trying to make sure that they don't have the foibles of the paradigm that they used.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
All right.
and yeah,
So let's talk a little bit more about acclimatization interventions again. What are some
sure.
ways that we can kind of induce anxiety or kind of that feeling of pressure? What are some ways that gamers specifically can? Well, let's talk about what they did
Yeah,
first to kind of induce
yeah,
that, and then let's talk about like what gamers can do to try
for sure.
to make that relevant to them.
A big one was self-consciousness training. So putting yourself in front of a video camera when you were training, or being very very hyper aware of what part of your body was being used to m- influence the game.
Mm-hmm.
Anxiety training, which was having a punishment for some reason, or using a combination of videotaping, challenging your ego, and then having an audience, and then a possible reward based on your performance. I think a really easy analogy to make here would be streaming.
Yeah,
Streaming
I think
puts
so
a
too.
audience, yeah, right in front of you, and you have to perform.
Right. Um, Also, I think wagers can be really useful for something like that, where you know there's a little bit of money
Yeah.
on the line.
Hmm.
Wagers and streaming, and I don't know if it's necessarily the best idea in the world to give yourself a negative connotation with exercise, but I know
Yep.
sometimes pros will have like a push-up challenge or something every time
Yep.
that. I think Nick A30 is really popular for doing this where if he gets eliminated, he has to do a certain number of push-ups based on some stringent conditions.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
I think some ways to kind of impose self punishment on yourself to really increase that kind of do or die mentality that really is present in game uh, scenarios. I think is really a great way to deal with that a little bit here.
Yeah.
Um,
And we should stress here that you don't want to train like this all the time. because feeling anxious to train, feeling self-conscious when you're training, it really sucks, and it might create that negative association you were talking about with exercise. You don't want to have that negative association with training either. So this can be a maybe once a month, once every 2 months, when you know you're ramping up to a competition, to make sure that you almost vaccinate yourself against the pressure.
Yeah, for sure. So what were some of the most consistent choking interventions that the
The,
study found?
so the biggest ones were the pre-performance routine, the quiet eye training, the left-hand contractions, and the use of a dual task when you're performing. We didn't
So
talk so
how
much
does
about the dual
that?
task.
Let's talk a little bit more
Yeah.
about that dual task because I was curious about
Yeah.
how that worked.
So the idea is that you have this movement pattern ingrained in your body already. You know how to do it. You've clicked on heads a million times in practice, and now you're just trying to replicate that when you're performing. So instead of step by step thinking about, okay, now I have to move my reticle this much to make sure I'm right at the spot, and going more for almost a flick, right? I know that's not necessarily the right option for every single aiming scenario, but it's a good analogy for what we're dealing with right now. So instead of thinking about, okay, I'm going to click this guy's head, I'm going to click this guy's head, it's more, okay, let me try to just think about what's my favorite color right now. It's almost something so irrelevant to what you're doing that it lets your body just take over and do what it needs to do, because you've trained it already. It knows what
Right.
to do. It's clicked on heads before. So all you have to do is just let it do what it's trained to do.
Yeah. Very interesting. I wonder if something like, I don't know, maybe singing along
Yep.
to a song or something like that would also
Yeah.
be useful. Something just to keep your brain occupied on something else while you're going through those
Yeah.
tasks that you've done ad nauseum.
Yep.
Okay.
It could be something like, oh, what's my favorite skin that just dropped in the latest battle
Right.
pass, or what song am I vibing with right now?
Yeah.
Those are all
Or
great
even
options.
reading your chat. I think for the streamers out there who stream
Hmm.
their practices, I think reading your chat is
Yeah.
also really a good way to kind of occupy your brain with something that's not necessarily what you're focusing on, and then trying to give a meaningful answer to what
Hmm.
people are asking.
Hmm.
Okay. Any other interventions there?
There was a quiet eye training that was more specific to something like putting in golf,
Okay.
where I'm sure you've all seen someone have to hit that long 30-foot putt, and it's always very impressive when they do, because that's a difficult shot to make. And what they were teaching people to do was actually right before they hit the ball is to actually look at their target. So this could be another parallel we could draw here would be something like an FPS, where you, instead of focusing so much on the reticule, you try to focus on the target instead, and just bring the reticule to the target.
Right. So sniping, I think, would be a really good analogy here, right? Something that you
Hmm.
kind of have to like kind of sit and think about. So focusing on the target, I think that's when I really noticed in my learning curve for Fortnite was when I started hitting
Yeah.
snipes. That I stopped focusing on where my reticle was in space and just kind of
Yeah.
feeling where my target was in space, and the reticle kind of naturally moved to where it needed to be.
Yeah.
Um,
Almost instead of being hyper focused, you relax your eyes a little bit so you can see more of what's happening.
yeah, for sure. Um, all right. And like we talked about, practicing under the self consciousness and anxiety conditions, I think, was also some of the
Hmm.
most effective ways at dealing with choking. So if we were talking to a standard gamer here and we were trying
Yeah.
to kind of walk them through some ways to be a little bit more mindful about what kind of choking they experience. So, say we had
Hmm.
a gamer come to us and say, "Hey, man, I just can't stop choking." Um,
Yeah.
what kind of things would we try to do to make them more aware of their own um, the problem that they've got going on, essentially, kind of how they
Yeah.
would differentiate between the two different types of choking, whether it be implicit or uh, external or internal, or the methods we described.
Yep. So the biggest ones were, so the way they break up the models for attention based. So they break it down to anxiety or attention, and then with intention, it's broken down into self-focus or distraction.
Okay.
So distraction being, okay, is my attention being taken away either internally or externally? And then self-focus is, am I focused too much on the step-by-step uh, execution of a task instead of letting it flow?
Okay.
So what I would ask the person is, what happened when you were in that choking situation? Did you feel like you couldn't focus properly, or were you too focused? And that really helps us draw down which path to go to. Because if you're too focused on your execution, then that might be okay. Then maybe you're more in the self-focus realm of things, versus, oh no, I was focused too much on chat, or I was focused too much on my buddy who was watching me. That might be more of a distraction, and particularly in this case, an external distraction.
Right. Awesome.
There is some overlap, I think, between an internal distraction and the self-focus model,
Hmm.
just because it, you could argue that you're distracting yourself by focusing so much on the step by step, but in this review they kept them distinct and separate.
Right. Right. Cool.
Yeah.
So to kind of summarize all of this, what would you say that this study could have maybe done a little bit better? Um,
It was a very good study, but I wish they had looked at some more elite athletes. They only ever got up to that expert level, and to really tease out those really tiny differences that make a huge impact on the game, you want to look at that elite top level. And the other thing was, it was only ever a once off with maybe one follow up. We don't have any long longitudinal studies here to see the effects of an intervention on a longer term period.
right. And I think that's a big, well, first off, we're missing this type of study in esports to begin with. But
Hmm.
I think that's a
Yep.
big issue we have with a lot of research that we do see with esports as well. Is they'll test an intervention and then there's no
Yep.
real. It hasn't been around long enough to look at these things longitudinally, which is really
Yeah.
important when you're doing research to see if these things actually make long term difference in player
Exactly.
development.
Right.
All right. So overall, this was a really interesting study look at choking, the different types that you can experience, and some interventions that you can utilize to kind of decrease this, whether you're a gamer
Hmm.
or someone that is a professional working with gamers. Um,
Yep.
I think these are really good things to kind of have in your back pocket, so you can be successful when it counts. Any
Yeah.
other final
Exactly.
thoughts, John?
I think if you are wanting to try some of these interventions yourself, I would start with breathing. It's the next time you notice that you're in that choking, okay, I don't know what I'm doing. I need to really perform at this moment. Try to bring it back to, am I breathing quickly? Am I breathing slowly? And if you are finding you're breathing quite rapidly, just try to slow it down a little bit. Don't try to force it. Just try to almost relax into a little bit of a slower state of breathing, and see if that makes your performance better or worse. And then after a few times in that situation, you can decide, okay, now the breathing doesn't work for me, or it does, and it's helping me out.
Right. And
Yeah.
so breathe or choking in general kind of comes from the sympathetic nervous system. So that means your fight or
Hmm.
flight system. So it's a response that your body has to extreme danger. So when we were getting chased by lions in the Sahara, we would have structures in place in our body and systems that would increase our heart rate, increase the ability of us to focus on specific things, which kind of leads into the different types of choking models that we see. An interesting way that we can kind of simulate that choking response is to exercise. So when you exercise, you're also stimulating that fight or flight response. So I would think it would be a worthwhile exercise, at least. I don't know if they really talked about doing it in this study, but from my perspective as a physical therapist, I think it's worthwhile to get yourself close to the end of a match and then try to elevate your heart rate by doing some very quick, very intense cardio exercise to where you're at least breathing hard. It doesn't have to be longer than 30 seconds, but I think something like some burpees or some mountain climbers or some
Yep.
really quick push-ups or something like that, just to kind of get that heart rate up right before you get into those scenarios where you know it's going to be do or die for the game. I think doing that a couple times just to kind of put yourself in that kind of response pattern where you do have the physiological side effects where you've got the sweaty palms and the shaky hand and the heavy breathing and the super focus. I think that's a really good way that we can try to bring this in. Again, that wasn't really backed up by the study, but that is just kind of my little recommendation here.
Yeah, I think it could easily fall into the acclimatization intervention scenario they were talking about, just adding your own artificial sense of pressure to your training to feel more used to it when it does come for real.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, John. Well, we did it. Here we are.
We did do it.
End of the Journal Club. That was Evidence-Based Esports, everybody. Thanks for watching. And again, we want to welcome Jon to the 1HP team. We hope that you guys stay healthy, stay active, and get out there and get some dubs. All right, guys.
Yeah.
1HP out. As Dr. Chung joins the 1HP team, you guys can expect to see a lot more content coming out of him as far as articles, videos, and social media posts go. Make sure you guys follow him on Twitter at JKChungDC to get all the updates for his content. Thanks again for watching, guys. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and share this video with all of your friends so they know what to do when they find themselves in a situation where they're choking. Finally, we'd like to pass the question off to you guys. Have you ever been in a situation in-game where you've choked and it cost you big time? Let us know in the comments below.